Hello, I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. Welcome to First Five Now, a Freedom Forum conversation series that explores topical issues and features current newsmakers who are using the five freedoms of the First Amendment to guide their work. Today, Jason Willick, an editorial writer with the Wall Street Journal, discusses his recent opinion piece headlined Speech and Sedition in 2021. In the column, he writes about viewpoint suppression of various media outlets in the wake of the Trump presidency and warns against those in power who are devising ways to use levers of power to restrict, regulate, and boycott opposition. This program is brought to you by the Freedom Forum, which fosters First Amendment freedoms for all. Our vision is an America where everyone knows, understands, values, and defends the freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And now, please welcome our moderator, Gene Policinski.
Welcome to First Five. I'm Gene Policinski. Our guest today is Jason Willick, who is an editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Willick is a graduate of Stanford University. He worked for Washington Interest in Washington, D.C. For 2 years before joining the Wall Street Journal in 2007, where he's an editorial writer. Again, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, the immediate prompt to invite you today was an editorial which you authored for the Journal entitled Speech and Sedition in 2021. I hate to do this to any writer who has crafted a piece, but could you give us an idea of what that editorial was about and sort of set the scene for people looking in?
Sure. Well, the theme of the editorial was sort of the growing mood among journalists and among cultural institutions toward a kind of viewpoint suppression. And especially in the wake of the Trump presidency, I think a lot of people are upset about the, President Trump's behavior, and especially this riot that took place. But I think that turned into something unhealthy, which was an impulse to, find viewpoints that are seen as aligned or seditious in some way, and throttle them in a way that's not consistent with our tradition of a free and open press. And the term sedition in the editorial is an analogy I made which I'm not sure if it's an exaggeration, but talking about the Sedition Act of the 1790s, some of the parallels between that mood and our own.
Because we're a show that features the First Amendment and the issues that you raise, I just wanted to begin by asking you, how does the First Amendment guide you in your work? What principles of that? And you touched a little bit on that. I'd like to ask you if you could expand on it.
Well, I mean, the press, any institution, any media institution, is protected by the First Amendment, which in America is, very broader than in most countries. You heard a lot of the press talking about this during the Trump administration, when the president would attack the press, say he wanted to open up libel laws, had this incredibly confrontational approach. People seem to value a lot that we have a free press. I worry that with the president gone and no longer drawing that contrast, some journalists are forgetting, we actually have this responsibility, and it's enshrined in the Constitution to seek truth and to have unpopular views and to sort of seek truth through the clash of different ideas. So I think it's especially important for journalists, the First Amendment, but I think that some journalists are sort of backing off of that tradition.
You mentioned a number of journalists who've written asking people to boycott or drop Fox News from cable enterprises and things. And of course, on the conservative side, you have people saying don't buy Nike products because they feature Colin Kaepernick in their advertising for Just Do It, things like that. What do you think is driving that idea of suppressing views rather than, which you make a very good case for, rather than saying the antidote to speech I don't like is more speech, rather than shutting down the speaker? That's an old First Amendment saw that you just speak out. What do you think is driving that impulse to restrain rather than to speak out yourself?
Well, I mentioned briefly the Sedition Act, and I do think it's a useful analogy because it was another time of extreme polarization between the Federalists, the ruling Federalists, and the Democratic Republicans. And the Federalists passed this Sedition Act. They said, you can't just say things that are false about the government. You can't just defame your leaders in this way. And I think there's the same impulse today. We are in power. We don't like all these false ideas going around. Wouldn't it be great if we could just make them disappear? And I think the urge is especially strong when you're in power. So the Federalists felt that they were the government, that the Democratic Republicans were sort of this illegitimate populist force. And I think you started to see censorship happen on campus in the 1990s and earlier because liberals are a majority there. And that's not necessarily because any one side likes to censor more, but whoever's in the majority has this natural impulse to do it. It's very natural to try to marginalize, and to some extent it's necessary, but you need to have to marginalize extremists. But in order to have a healthy debate, you need views. You need to embrace, I think, a certain level of openness that I am worried that some people in our country are no longer wedded to that idea. I think it would be more convenient if one view could just dominate.
Yeah, the Sedition Act came about, what was it, like 7 years after we got the Bill of Rights? So, and of course, it was a 2-year experiment, really. 18 editors roughly got jailed. The country said, wait a minute, that's not the way to go. We sort of stayed away from that, although we had periodic lapses. I think you mentioned the Red Scare in the early, late 1918, roughly 1920, McCarthy period. You mentioned those in your editorial. Again, we seem to have that cyclical idea of, again, whichever party is in power, or social description is in vogue at the moment, liberal, conservative. Again, why is it so hard in your mind? And again, you I think touch on this in editorial to embrace this idea of the marketplace of ideas. Is it that natural instinct that is just a human condition that we censor that thing we don't like?
Yeah, I think the idea of competing views is very unnatural. It's very, I think, anybody, throughout human history, you have a society of a lot of people with diverse opinions. And let's be honest, in order to have a society that functions, you do need to agree on certain common precepts. You do need general agreement. So I think there's as a kind of human, I'm not a psychologist or a evolutionary biologist, but the way that we form social order, I think that we try to conform, and I think some level of that, again, you do need to have a functioning society. But I think that this marketplace of ideas, or a protection for the First Amendment, is sort of an unnatural constraint that liberal societies put on themselves to basically try to put limits on the ability of the dominant group to force minority groups into conformity. And I think that that's an important limit, but it's always one that needs protecting because it goes totally against our intuition.
Yeah, I think Jefferson and others called it the tyranny of the majority. And again, I think you've outlined that in your view of where we are today. A terrible question to ask an editorial writer or anybody, but what's the solution? What's the way out of this dilemma? Is it just voices like yours saying, wait a minute, let's rebalance the equation? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think, I think that, people, journalists and, people who work at tech companies, people who have the ability to act as gatekeepers, right now they all feel, you saw the booting of Parler, the social media platform, right, that was
which just went back online. Yeah.
Recently went back online on new servers, but it was, kicked off by Amazon and Google and Apple from their various app stores and web services. I I think the people who are running those places are trying to be responsible, and they're thinking, well, wait a second, this is a bad influence. It's my responsibility to close down this website. But I think we need our establishment or our elites or people in those positions to have a better understanding of pluralism and say, look, it's a diverse country. Is this really the best use of my power? Because most of what we talk about in the editorial is not government suppression.
Right.
It's a mood. It's corporate. It's in the press. It's the press saying, it's the press, pressuring social media companies to crack down on more speech. It's urging now these boycotts of speech that we don't like. So I think we need leaders in our society to be more, think through more carefully the road that we're going down, and just sort of have more tolerance for pluralism, and not mistake their own cultural views for the entirety of the country's.
Now, you mentioned this. I know you grew up in the Silicon Valley area, but you touched on it just now, that the tech companies' role. You can make the argument that what was the old village square is now the village screen, so to speak. That's where we gather as communities, whatever type of community we belong to have discussions. Again, do you see a way out of the conundrum of the idea that these are private companies, they have their own First Amendment rights, the government's not involved at the moment, that terms of service say if they want to kick me off, they can kick me off. What's the way out of that dilemma that they have their own First Amendment rights to silence me? Is it, as you're saying, sort of appealing to their better angels, or is there a role for government here, which raises First Amendment concerns for me, but maybe that's the way out? I'm curious what you have to say.
Yeah, well, my preference would be if they were to lead and make prudent decisions, because there's not going to be pornography all over Facebook. There's going to be things that are taken down. There's going to be beheading videos taken off YouTube. We're going to have a role for moderation. My preference would be if these companies would use that authority responsibly. And Mark Zuckerberg, I think it was in 2019, he went to Washington, D.C., and he gave a speech, on the importance of First Amendment values, because he's under a lot of pressure to act as the censor for whichever group is louder at a given time. And he tried to push back on this. Now, in the last year, he's basically retreated on not almost all, I should say, but many of those commitments. I mean, he started to police political speech to a much greater extent than he hoped that he would. And part of that is because, President Trump has not made it easy for him with his, various totally reckless and irresponsible statements around the election. But I would prefer, I'm getting to your question, my preference would be that these executives who have this role wield their power responsibly. I think that is sort of a lost cause, it appears. I mean, I thought, they're going so far in the other direction that I just think we're headed to a political clash. And so I do think we're going to see new interventions of the courts and and legislatures, perhaps. And I think you may start to see some rethinking of this First Amendment question if these are common carriers. Richard Epstein in our pages talked about common carriers and the law of monopolies and the extent that you could say, listen, you can't just deny service arbitrarily to somebody if this is going to be your role in our economy. So I think you could see some jurisprudence move in that direction. I think you could see, you already have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act under fire from both sides. And if that law is changed, I think you could see, legislatures, try to perhaps regulate in certain ways what these platforms can do. And again, especially, as another example of the media pining for censorship, you had the New York Times recently say we need a reality czar, or an author in the New York Times, a reality czar, which would be a government official who works with these tech companies, and coordinates with them to stomp out misinformation. So again, to the extent that we start to see actual government working together with large corporations, I think that also has to raise First Amendment questions. So I think it's very much unsettled, but I would not rule out either legislation or judicial intervention that changes somewhat these prerogatives, as long as we're in this clash that seems to have no resolution between the companies and, frankly, increasingly, populists and Republican parties.
We have time for one more question and answer. You raised the issue of the fairness doctrine. That may be some version of the fairness doctrine. I don't think you necessarily advocate it, but you cited it as something. I'm old enough to remember the fairness doctrine in play, and one of the issues that actually came about there was that it was seen by conservative talk radio hosts as a threat, because their ability to express their opinion over the public airwaves when they were broadcasting rather than on satellite or cable, some private provider, might have been endangered by the fact that they would have to give equal time for other views. But liberal commentators as well, a lot of lawyers advise TV stations don't do things like sponsor debates, because if you have 6 mayoral candidates and leave out one who's got no chance of winning, you might potentially be facing legal action. So the fairness doctrine wound up in some ways being counterproductive. Government seems an awkward tool to force this kind of fairness venture. But again, were you saying we should go back to something like the fairness doctrine with maybe faults, but that its positives would outweigh the faults of it?
No, I wasn't saying that at all. I was just using that as another example of these calls among the press to sort of restore control over media that they dislike. I think we're certainly. Look, we have a problem of. Part of this is a technological problem. It's true that to some extent, this debate is driven by new technologies, which make it easier to spread one's opinions, give everyone a microphone,
Right.
And so I think that is part of the problem, and there's an urge to regulate to sort of restore this old order that we had before this new technology. And I think that's, for the most part, futile. We're going to have to learn to live with the technology and information environment that we have.
Well, thank you for a very thoughtful editorial that raises, I think, a lot of issues that people should consider. And again, I think a First Amendment marketplace of ideas is what you're really arguing for. And I think that's very much in keeping with the First Amendment. Opinions of all should be heard. I think Justice Jackson once said, we need to hear that which we even find vile and repugnant, if only to be better prepared to argue against it. So I think you're making that modern day case that Justice Jackson made in the 1940s. So thank you for that. Our guest has been Jason Willick, who's an editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal. And the editorial in question is Sedition in 2021, Suppression and Sedition in 2021. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks very much.
First Five Now is a production of the Freedom Forum. It is a series of interviews and other programs about the First Amendment. You can find this program and others at freedomforum.org.